A very warm welcome to IMF Inspired. I'm Sabina Bhatia. I have two amazing guests today. You all know Malala Yousafzai. She's a fearless advocate for girls' education and co-founder of the Malala Fund, as well as the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. A warm welcome to you, Malala. It's an honor to have you with us. Also joining our conversation today is Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF. Under her leadership, the IMF has stepped up its work on gender, and Kristalina herself has been a strong advocate for women's inclusion in the workforce, especially in leadership positions. Great to have you with us, Kristalina. So we have with us two leaders, an activist and an economist, and I hope in our conversation today we will hear why breaking barriers to women's empowerment is both a moral imperative and an economic one. Let me start with you, Malala. 130 million girls out of school. Girls were missing from the classroom even before the pandemic started, and the situation just got worse with the pandemic. So what can we do about this?
Thank you so much, Sabina. And yes, you are right. The world is facing a girls' education crisis. There are 130 million girls out of school, and this is a figure that comes from before the pandemic. Now, there are millions of more girls at risk of losing education because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also climate change and conflicts. And when we were starting at 2020, this was supposed to be a decade of delivery. We were hoping that we would see more progress, but unfortunately, because of these external shocks and because of lack of investment in education, we are seeing a reversal of the achievements and the progress that has been made so far for girls' education. And I'm worried about not seeing any progress in the coming years. So it is a reminder to all of us that we need to accelerate our efforts for girls' education, and it has become more important than ever. And there are two things that need to happen. The first one is financing for education. We know that there's a huge gap in financing for education, especially in the low and lower middle income countries. So the first thing that needs to happen is that donor countries should continue and increase financing for education, especially girls' education. We would encourage developed countries to give 0.7% of their GDP towards foreign aid, and that should include a focus on girls' education. And there are also other ways in which they can help the developing countries. We know that the developing countries have huge debts that they have to pay back, and most of them then have to sacrifice things like education and health in order to repay those debts. So special exemptions and debt reliefs can help those countries to allocate those resources towards girls' education and ensure that those economies can recover and have a future in the long term. And we also know that financing for education is step one. And that brings us to the second step, which is allocating these resources efficiently and ensuring that it gives us the quality education that we need for our future. We need to ensure that we reach out to the most marginalized communities. We know that girls who come from lower income background are more likely to miss out on their education. They are usually the first ones to drop out and then the last ones to return to their schools. So in this time, it's really important that we find out mechanisms in which we can support their education, and that includes finding ways in which they can have access to technology to receive education online, or receiving any other financial support that they need to continue their education and be able to get back into school. So a lot needs to happen in this time of pandemic. We know that that children should not be missing out on schools. Every child should have the right to be back in school, to be back as soon as possible. And we know that if children remain out of school for months and years, it would be very difficult for them to catch up. So I think it's important for leaders to both invest financially, but also ensure that it is the quality education that they are aiming for.
So Kristalina, you've just heard Malala say financing for education. You speak to ministers of finance regularly. How do you convince them that investing in girls' education, and more broadly in women, is good for countries?
Let me welcome Malala first. Since we last met you graduated from university, and you got married. Congratulations for both. One thing that has not changed, though, is how passionately you speak on behalf of girls' educations. So what do? I put some of the same passion into talking to ministers of finance, and the message I have to them is very simple. If you want growth to be higher, if you want your budget revenues to increase, please educate girls and empower women. No country can succeed without tapping in the full potential of all its people, men and women. It's like clapping with one hand. And then what we do at the fund are three very important things. One, we put the evidence. For example, when we talk about including women increases growth, we have calculated that if women have the same access to labor market as men, in the United States, GDP would be 5% higher, in Japan, 9% higher, in India, 27% higher, in Egypt, 34% higher. So you want to have prosperity, make sure that women can contribute to their communities, to their societies. The second thing we do is we, in our work with countries, encourage protection of social spending. Malala spoke about the fact that the pandemic is pushing poor countries further behind. And it is depriving girls and boys, but especially girls, from education. When the pandemic ends, it is more likely boys would go back to school than girls. So what we want is in the social spending to protect education and health, and also to make sure that it is visible whether girls go to school, whether women can work. And the third thing we do, and Malala, I know that you have seen that and you have spoken about it, we walk our own talk. We are about to have our gender strategy for the fund, and we also actively promote women to positions of authority. Malala, I have a great report for you. For the first time in the history of the International Monetary Fund, at the top we have 5 people, 3 of them are women. Never happened before, but when it happens at all the levels of authority, the conversation changes. Women do bring a different perspective, and as a result, we make better decisions.
So, Malala, I want to come back to the point that Kristalina made, which is that as the pandemic ends, we'll see boys going back to school and not the girls so much. I know the Malala Fund is working at the grassroots level. Can you tell us what you're doing to make sure that girls really do go back to school?
Malala Fund is committed to ensuring that we create a world where all girls can have access to safe, quality, and free education, and that it is an education of 12 years. And we also know that it is the secondary education that is often not receiving the investment that it requires. There's a huge gap in investment in secondary education. So it has become part of our work, and we invest in local education activists to target those barriers that girls face in access to education. They are doing research on why girls are missing out in which communities and how can we address those issues. They're also talking about digital education and how we can reach out to girls in the most marginalized communities to have access to quality education. And they're also doing activism on local and national level to advocate for safer and quality education in their communities. We are working in more than we are working in 10 countries, and it includes Nigeria, Pakistan, Brazil, India, and previously Afghanistan as well. And these activists have done remarkable work, including passing legislation in the state of Kaduna in Nigeria, which has ensured that they reduce the hidden fees that students have to face in their education, which oftentimes limits girls from having access to education because their parents can't afford to get them uniform, books, and other school-related facilities. And the same achievements we are seeing like literally every time when they're doing their advocacy, their campaigning, and we believe in the activism of local education activists because they know best what's happening in that area and how they can address those issues. And in this pandemic time, they have been able to focus on having access to education while children are still at home. This is a time when we become more creative and think about the resources we have in technology and how we can use that to still ensure that children continue their studies. And for instance, in Nigeria, in the northern states, they used radios to ensure that girls can continue receiving their school lessons while they are at home. In Pakistan, they use the national television. They also have an app by this organization called Talimabad. In Lebanon as well, they're using technology to ensure that children, including Syrian refugee children, can continue their education. And when you look at the creativity of young activists fighting for girls' education, it gives you hope that it is possible that we bring up solutions for the crisis of education that we are facing.
So I want to pick up on something you just said. You mentioned Syrian refugees, and I want to talk a little bit about refugees. You have written a heart-wrenching book, We Are Displaced. And we're seeing news stories coming out of Ukraine, before that Afghanistan, Syria, many other countries, unfortunately. The humanitarian crisis is really tragic. So Malala, my question is, what can be done to protect the well-being, the safety, the rights of refugee children?
I wrote that book, We Are Displaced, because we oftentimes hear about refugees, but we rarely hear from them. And I wrote that book where I included refugee girls from around the world who have been forced into displacement because of conflicts and other reasons. And their stories are truly inspiring because they did not give up against the barriers, against the difficulties that they were facing. And wherever they are finding peace and they resettle, their first dream is to be back in school. Yeah. They don't want anything but education. And a girl knows that her future is safe when she is in school. And she knows that she can build a future for herself and for her community when she gets complete and quality education. Education for refugee children is a big issue. And when we talk about education, we need to be attentive to the fact that we should not leave behind children from marginalized communities. We should not leave behind girls, and we should not leave behind refugee children and refugee girls. When families are facing difficult circumstances, that firstly, that there are not enough facilities for refugee children. They are not enrolled into the local schools. There are no proper facilities. They're oftentimes asked for certificates when they don't even have those, because who thinks about collecting certificates when they're becoming refugees in a conflict zone, and many other issues. And because of that, many children miss out on their education. And then girls are forced into marriages as well, because the families have no other way to cope with the crisis. So it's really important for our leaders, for our education ministers who are listening right now, to not forget refugee children, that they should not forget refugee girls. The number of children who are refugees is in millions. And they are important for the future of this world. We cannot leave them behind. So it's important to ensure that the education of every child is important, it is recognized, it is prioritized, and no child is left behind, including girls, including refugees, including children from marginalized communities.
Let's not leave anyone behind. Malala, you are at the IMF, at least virtually, with the managing director. What would you like to see from the international community?
Oh, I think I can talk about this for a very long time. I think there's a lot that foreign ministers, country leaders, corporates, and other civil activists can do to ensure that we see that world where every child has access to safe, quality education in our lifetime. We can see all girls having access to education. We can see refugee children having access to education in our lifetime if we ensure that we remain committed to this mission. We do not just make verbal statements in favor of it, but we make financial level commitments and we ensure that our policies are in favor of what we say. So I hope that everyone who's here today will look into mechanisms in which they can ensure that financing for education is increased, that they also ensure that they look at the future of education from the lens of inclusivity, access, and affordability, and they ensure that that we see that world very soon in which no child is left behind and all children can have access to safe and complete education. And the ways are there, like, as I mentioned previously, ensure that you meet the GDP percentage that you need for foreign aid, that you support the multilateral and the bilateral mechanisms that are there to ensure that there is enough funding for education, and that you give a specific focus to gender, because we know that many girls are not given access to education simply because they're girls, because the policies are not in favor of them, because they don't look at these factors. So if we look at this factor, we can come up with policies that help us target the issues that girls are facing in specific and ensure that girls are not left behind. So I hope that everyone who's listening will take this as their top priority and ensure that this topic does not die and it continues to be part of the important conversations.
Kristalina, any thoughts from you on this?
Listening to Malala, it brings memories from the times I was humanitarian commissioner. The Syria war pushed hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes, and I was visiting a Syrian family in Lebanon and met this girl, Aisha, who made me a better person. I asked her, what is she dreaming of? And Aisha said, I want to go back to school. And at that point, I said to her, I hope this would happen. And the moment I said it, I was so ashamed of myself, because me hoping means nothing to her, but me acting can make a difference. So I walked out of this meeting with Aisha, and then I drove the European Commission at that time to work with UNICEF and other bilateral donors to do exactly what Malala is talking about. Every child, boy and girl, has the right of education. And I want to praise Lebanon for making a huge effort to bring children in schools. And let's remember now the country is going through a very difficult time. We need to think of these children, the Lebanese children, but also the refugee children. What is the big message from that? If we want to live in a world that is peaceful and prosperous, we have to make sure that our children have good quality education so they can contribute to this world, and that girls are there, because girls very often are those that bring more empathy for others. When they become adults, they care about the education of their own children, they care about the health of their families, and we know how money earned by women gets spent. So that simple message that we recognize that women play a tremendously important role for their families, for their communities, for their countries, and that what we do for women is for all of us. It is morally right, but it is also great economics.
Yes, absolutely. And just on that, as societies and countries begin the process of transformation, what is the IMF doing to help countries that are coming out of fragility and conflict?
We have to recognize that we live in a more shock-prone world. And for many communities and countries, that translates into a prolonged period of instability. Today, nearly 1/4 of the members of the IMF are countries that are either in conflict or coming out of a conflict or suffering from violence in their societies. We have to respond to their needs, but to respond, we have to understand them. So we have just recently adopted a strategy on how we deal with fragile and conflict-affected states, in which we very humbly identify our role, and it is on macro policies, on how you make sure that there is transparency and accountability for revenues in even in a fragile environment, how to direct public spending to the most impactful avenues, and of course, education and health, investing in people is one of those. We also recognize that we have to work with others, with our development partners, with activists, with the organizations that are set, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, to work in these environments. So together we make a difference. When each one of us recognizes that for us to be respectful of our membership, we have to do our best for those that have the hardest time, and then work with others. Then we actually can see countries taking a turn, like Somalia did. Yes, they're still struggling, but Somalia today is a much more hopeful place than it was before it returned to the international community. I so much hope that the same would be the pathway for Afghanistan. And as I drew my conclusion from my conversation with Aisha, hope is great, but not enough. So everything we can do to encourage that shift in fragile environments, find the foundation for overcoming it. And Malala spoke in Doha very, very well about one of these foundations. And it is, once you get girls into school and you have that opportunity for them to grow, you cannot take it away. So Malala, I heard you saying that you cannot take from the Afghan girls what they earned, and I agree with you, you're right.
So on that and on girls, Malala, your journey as a young girl, from a student to now an activist for girls' education, has been a remarkable journey. As you look back on your experiences, what advice do you have for young women who want to bring about social change? How can they make a difference?
I have met incredible girls all around the world. And as Kristalina mentioned, those girls know what they want. They know what a world should be like for them, what it means to have an equal and feminist world. And you know, I don't think I need to give them any advice. They don't need any. They are already doing remarkable work. They're raising their voices. They are not just talking about problems, but they're talking about solutions to those problems and how we can address some of the world's most pressing problems, from poverty, gender discrimination, to climate change. But I do have a message from them that I want to bring to this conversation today. You know, why is it that we are not investing in education for girls? Why is it that we still live in a world where millions of children remain out of school? And there are so many leaders and foreign ministers who are here. And I want to ask you a question. You know, what is your for your country, for this world? Do you want to see economic growth? Well, if you educate all girls and give them access to complete quality education, it adds up to $30 trillion to the world economy. Do you want improvement in gender equality? Do you want to see that gap being closed? Well, we know when girls are educated, they are in a much better position to have an independent life, to earn for themselves, and to stand on their own 2 feet. And if your priority is to have a world of liberty and freedom for all, well, when you educate girls, it helps them to stand on their own 2 feet and have their voices in community. So even if your priority is to address climate change or to reduce poverty, we know that when girls are educated, when women are empowered, poverty reduces, the likelihood of conflict reduces, and it can also help us mitigate climate change as well. So I know that you all have big ambitions and dreams for your countries. You want to make this world a safer, better place for all, and there is a way to make that happen. And we know that that sustainable investment is girls' education and is gender equality. So I hope that you will make it happen sooner. I hope you remember the SDG goal 4, and that hopefully by 2030 we reach that goal and we accelerate the work for girls' education in this time. I think this is what every girl would like to say. If you ask those millions of girls who are out of school in your country and elsewhere, they would ask you for one thing, and that is education.
Yep. A powerful message from you, Malala. Kristalina, do you think these issues will come up at the spring meetings, and this is something that we can press with our ministers of finance who will be gathering together?
They will come, because the meetings are going to be concentrated on how we deal with a crisis upon a crisis, the pandemic and now a war in Europe. These two crises have slowed down economies everywhere. And unfortunately, when we look at the impact of the pandemic in particular, it has been quite devastating for women, for young people, for low-skilled workers. If we want to bring the economy back on track, we have to make the right investments. And I want to stress that educating girls, this is not a spending, it is an investment in them and in the future of the countries. Fortunately, we have seen much more awareness about the role of human capital, the investment that needs to be made in health, education, social protection. One of the lessons from the pandemic actually was exactly that. Countries that had stronger social fabric, high education and inclusion, they dealt much better with the shock. So my message has been and will continue to be, we have to build resilience to this more shock-prone future where from climate change to geopolitical tensions, we face more reasons to strive for that resilience of our societies. And the most important factor is resilient people. Yes, resilient banking system is very important. Yes, we have to think about it, but resilient people, resilient planet, prerequisites for us to have a secured future.
So, Kristalina, I do want to ask you a personal question. You grew up in Bulgaria in a very different era. And as a young woman, you probably did not imagine you would become the managing director of the IMF. So can you tell us a little bit about your childhood experiences, how they shaped you and made you the leader that you are?
Well, for quite some time, living on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I didn't really know what was the IMF. My country was not a member until early 90s. I was very fortunate to grow up in a loving family. And my father, like Malala's father, really wanted both my brother and me to be well educated. I was the first in my extended family to have university degree and then a PhD. But I also saw firsthand hardship, the costs of bad policies, and how macro decisions have micro implications. If they're good, they open opportunities for people. And if they're bad, they create hardship. What that makes me today is a leader of the IMF that recognizes that policies are for people. They're not for the paper, they're not for the books, they are for improving people's lives. And we can only make good choices when we think through the consequences of these choices from the prism of how we make society more prosperous for all its people.
Mm-hmm. Policies for people. That's a very, very good thought. So now we turn to the fun part of our conversation. So we call this the lightning round. There are no right or wrong answers. We just want to know what makes each of you tick. So I'm going to ask each of you the same question. So I'll start with you, Malala. Who is your favorite musician, male or female?
Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and Beyonce.
Oh, two very different ones. Okay. Kristalina.
Yo-Yo Ma, and in my youth, John Lennon.
Oh, lovely. Very good choices. Malala, what is your go-to platform for news?
Notifications that I get, the news ones, TV channels, and sometimes it's Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Kristalina?
Well, the IMF news selection. And of course, like everybody, I check on my phone my favorite Financial Times, The Economist. And like Malala, actually, I check on Twitter what is top of mind of people around the world.
And what is your favorite TV show that got you through the pandemic, Malala?
I watched so many shows during the pandemic. Ted Lasso, Cobra Kai, just any show that is trending, I'll watch it anytime.
Kristalina?
Well, one day I would like to know how was the graduation and the marriage during the pandemic, and what would you tell us about that? But I'm not going to push this on Malala today. For me, I love documentaries about history, geography, like the Silk Road, or the Roosevelts, about people. And when I really want to relax, I watch The Big Bang.
Oh, fun. And Kristalina, where would you like to travel next?
To a peaceful Ukraine.
Oh, lovely thought. Malala, where would you like to travel?
My top country is always Pakistan, but I have a bias. But then I think I would love to go to Afghanistan as well. I think the girls and women need our voices. They need our presence there. So that would be next on the list.
And your favorite sport, Malala?
Cricket. I love cricket. And badminton.
Cricket and badminton. Yours, Kristalina?
Well, cricket, one day you need to really help me understand.
Sure.
I like team sports. I like basketball. I used to play handball, and I love watching soccer.
And Kristalina, social media of your choice, Instagram or Twitter?
Twitter.
Twitter. Malala?
It's very difficult to pick, but I think these days it's Twitter for sure, because we are, seeing news all the time, and I think Twitter is best for that.
Okay, fair enough. If you could have dinner with one woman in history, Malala, who would that be?
I would like to have dinner with Benazir Bhutto. She was the first female prime minister of Pakistan, but also first female Muslim prime minister as well. So I would like to, have an opportunity to chat with her and hear her story of leadership for women.
Kristalina?
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, yes.
She stood for social values. She actually stood for women and was a very humble woman, very powerful because of whose wife she was, but very approachable and a great role model for women.
Yes, an amazing woman indeed. And Malala, what was the best book that you read during the pandemic?
I read quite a few books. 50 Words for Rain by Aisha Lemy, Pure Color, and yeah, that's the only two I can think of right now.
Okay, well, that's good. Kristalina?
Well, one of the books we promoted actually through one of our engagements is Invisible Women. Caroline Criado Perez.
Okay.
And Malala, I recommend it very much because what Caroline did was to show how data is biased because it is collected and composed by men. And what we can do to change that. It's a great book.
Okay. And my final question, who inspires you, Kristalina?
Many, many, many women and men. But I want to pay tribute today to the late Madeleine Albright. She, like me, came from the eastern part of Central Europe. She, like me, reached the unthinkable for when she was young. And much more than me, she has touched the lives of people around the world. I only hope to do as much as I can to be following in her footsteps.
Beautiful thought. And who inspires you, Malala? You yourself are an inspiration to all of us. So
many people have inspired me. I always appreciate people who show compassion, love, and kindness, and that are my teachers, my parents, and other loved ones in my community. But also, it's the passion and bravery and courage of young girls activists. I am in awe of their courage, including Vanessa Nakate and Greta and many others. I hope that they continue their activism. It gives me hope to see them.
It gives us hope to see you.
well said.
Thank you. The presence of women is crucial in positions of power, in positions of responsibility, in positions of movements and activism. We need to see more and more women's faces, women's voices. They are half of the population of the world. Like, they should be there.
Yes.
There are economic and social and political advantages. That is an addition. But even despite that, women deserve a role. It is their right.
Well said. And on that note, any final thoughts from you, Kristalina?
We hope to have Malala with us in person next time around. And thank you for bringing the voice of the hundreds of millions of young women like you.
Thank you.
So we, our generation, can do the right thing for the next one.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts from you, Malala?
I just am so grateful for this opportunity, and I hope everyone listening to us will hear our recommendations and ensure that we get together and we have thoughtful conversations about how we can make this world a better and inclusive place for all, because these are some of the world's pressing problems and we cannot let them be as they are. Change is required. There is no alternative to this. So it's important that we take action and we ensure that we see a world where women are treated fairly and all girls and boys can go to school.
Okay, on that note, let me thank you both. Thank you, Malala, very, very much for joining us. Thank you, Kristalina.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to both of you for inspiring women all around the world to keep on breaking barriers. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for watching. From the IMF in Washington, this is Sabina Bhatia.